Okay, so the next film we're going to talk about, which is playing at the Glasgow Film Festival and is also coming out in cinemas very shortly after and has been on the festival circuit, is True History of the Kelly Gang. Now, this is it's based on a Peter Carey book about the life of kind of infamous Australian outlaw Ned Kelly. And it basically follows his life through 3 different segments, which have been delineated. Boy, which follows his life as a child, with his mother in Australia, obviously, and his mother is Irish, his father is Irish, and their interactions with kind of the local colonial authorities. The second segment is Man, where he's now a grown man and is becoming the man, the myth, the infamous legend, if you like, Ned Kelly. And then the final section, Monitor, which leads up to his quite well-known final stand against the authorities when he was finally kind of brought to justice, I suppose, is maybe the way you'd put it. Ned Kelly's played by George MacKay, who, of course, has been in quite a lot of things in the past few years, but I think 1917 is probably what most people will probably know him for now, even though he has been in quite a lot of things recently. So this is screening at the festival on the 27th and the 28th, and the 28th is, in fact, the day it comes out in cinemas nationwide. It's directed by Justin Kurzel, who has directed a few things before. Snowtown, which I've not seen, but the features that I have seen are Macbeth. He did an adaptation of that, which I was actually rather keen on. I seem to be in a minority on that one, but I was quite taken with it. The follow-up to that was a video game adaptation, Assassin's Creed, which was a bit underwhelming. I don't think it's as bad as it was made out, but it's not particularly great either. So this is kind of his return to home turf. Justin Kurzel is Australian, and he's gone for a very stylised approach to this, I think. Carice, you're the other person in the studio who's seen this besides me. What did you make of the film and how they've approached this? I've not read the book, so I don't know how it works as an adaptation, but how did you find it as the story of Ned Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, this is my sort of first learning of Ned Kelly as a character. So, yeah, I mean, it's a film that, tonally speaking, seems to sort of range from horrible to ghastly, which for a viewer is fairly relentless. It doesn't really let up. It doesn't really give much time to consider what it is that's being told and what it is we're meant to be feeling and where we're meant to be sort of positioning ourselves as viewers. I guess the things I do like are, so obviously Boy being the first chapter, Ned Kelly is initially played by a young actor called Orlando Schwert, who I think is significantly better as an actor than George MacKay, but I no secrets in my dislike for George MacKay as an actor. I'm sure he's a lovely man. So Orlando Schwert playing Ned Kelly as a young boy, and that's throughout the whole of Act 1. I think Act 1's probably the best bit of the film for me. You start to get an idea of the world that this boy is living in, daily struggles that he and his family have to go through. But as it shifts into the rest of the film, I feel like that young Ned Kelly character, even though he's very quickly corrupted, is sort of left behind as the only pure or good thing in the film. And I'm not one that thinks that films need to have moral binaries that these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. But in this film, it doesn't do that. It feels like everyone is just bad, and I don't really know if I'm meant to be feeling sorry for anyone. And I think there's the point I particularly kind of came to this feeling is in the epilogue of the film, the voiceover narration of George MacKay as Ned Kelly is addressing his son, and he says to his son something along the lines of, "Remember, you are a Kelly and you are loved." And I don't really know what "You Are a Kelly" is meant to make us feel. Like, all of the Kelly characters are pretty awful. I mean, Essie Davis as the mum is probably the only one who we can maybe feel sorry for, but I guess I don't really want to sort of feel sorry for her. I want to feel like she does something great, she has some strength, but actually she's equally kind of part of the problem and makes some quite dubious moral choices involving her family. And I guess also Kate, who's Ned Kelly's sister, is also quite innocent, but perhaps like too much so. I feel like she doesn't she's almost created as like a bit of a idiot character almost. Like she doesn't say anything. She's just kind of like used as a prop between these two.
There's certainly very little agency in that character.
Yeah, and there's something to the fact that they don't. When Nicholas Hoult, who's introduced partway through the film as Ned Kelly's counterpoint, makes sort of advances to Ned Kelly's young sister, and she doesn't really get a say in this. She's spoken to, but she doesn't really answer. And yeah, so go back to my initial point. I don't really know what "You're a Kelly" is meant to mean and what that's meant to make us feel. And the fact that "You Are Loved," I think, is a lie, because we don't really know what happened to the child. He definitely isn't brought into a world that has much love in it. And I definitely found myself just at the end of the film thinking, what was I meant to get from that? As something that's a new adaptation and a new creation of an old story, you'd like to think that it's deliberately bringing something relevant to the point in time that we're in, or just kind of relevant to human nature, something new to be said about human nature. And I don't really feel like it does that.
I think I'd kind of agree with that. I think I perhaps got more out of it than it sounds like you did. But the issue is that I can point to any one thing in this film and find something to it. I think there's connecting segments that are visually very interesting. I think the finale of the film is shot in a very interesting way, and and if I'm being perfectly honest, this is also what I liked about Kurzel's Macbeth. It had a lot of issues, but there were certain visual elements that I kind of really, really liked. There are here as well. The problem is, when you bring all these things together, and there are a lot of good things, like so I don't have the same sort of like dislike for George MacKay as an actor. I think he does an okay job here. I think he does reasonably well. All the characters around him, I think, fulfill their roles very well. I think Nicholas Hoult, it kind of gets the bulk of the antagonistic running time. We are introduced to Charlie Hunnam in the first section, who's doing a similar sort of thing, and they all do very good jobs, I think. But the problem is, it doesn't really coalesce into much. And there's actually a little bit of overlap with Macbeth, really, in the sense that this idea kind of like that a man doing reprehensible things and kind of what the motivations are. And this is where I think some of the stuff you said about the culpability of his mother comes in, because she's almost, for bits of it, kind of like a little bit like a Lady Macbeth type figure to me. So it almost feels like there's some overlap, but it's not really saying much of a huge amount of interest, if I'm being honest. There are plenty of segments I can point to and say, visually, I find that really interesting. I find that really engaging, but I don't know what I was trying to say with it. And in particular, the second and third segments, in terms of a narrative structure and the progression of it, I mean, I don't think it really hung together at all.
Yeah, I found myself quite confused by the world that I was in as well, as to the distance between one spot and another spot, because for a lot of it, the setting is this sort of wooden house in the middle of the Australian outback that the Kelly family live in. And then, due to various reasons, Ned Kelly sort of separated from his family, and that time span is about 10 years, I think, until he returns to his family. And you're introduced to that second section with him in a room that Nicholas Hoult is also in. And then he for no particularly well-explained reason, George MacKay decides to return back to his family. And in my head, I felt like those were two very different worlds, two very different spaces, both geographically and kind of practically speaking. He was maybe making a choice to sort of step away from that world. And then all of a sudden, Nicholas Hoult is there within the space of the family home. And I'm that sort of led me to be a bit confused as to, has he been just sort of down the I mean, I know that nowhere's really down the road in Australia, like it's a massive kind of vast nation, but has he just kind of been down the road for a little bit, just killing time, wrestling in a room of British, English gentry, and then for no particular reason has decided that he'll return to the family home. So I got a little bit confused there as to the sort of the time and the motivations and the geography of it.
And I think that's a bit of a shame, because I don't know how you feel about it, but the first segment with him as a child, I actually think works rather well. I find very little fault with that segment, to be honest. I find that the most interesting bit, so much so that I will even forgive it for giving me Les Mis flashbacks when Russell Crowe starts singing at one point. Because, of course, Russell Crowe, he's only in that segment. It's a very short role. He's playing a Harry Power, who's kind of like a local, person of local infamy, who basically ends up owning Ned Kelly, effectively, the young boy. And you start to see the influence that character has on this child. And that, to me, was the most interesting segment of the film. The problem is, when we then jump to adult George MacKay, I feel like we've skipped quite a lot of beats, and quite a lot of interesting beats at that. And at that point, I do wonder if there's a little bit of assumed knowledge going on. Because this is my introduction to Ned. I mean, I know of the name Ned Kelly, right, because it's one of these names that pops up. But I knew, and probably still know, very little about the story of his life. So I am wondering if there's a certain amount of assumed knowledge there. In particular, I understand, like, the final stand that we see, that's kind of like a very noted incident. So it's more a case of I don't feel like it's telling a story very well. That's the thing. There's a lot of kind of like interesting visuals, but even then it gets a little bit muddy. There's a lot of kind of, I think, snorri cam, when you attach it in front of someone's face and it follows them around in this kind of like very hectic way. That's used more than once, and I don't feel it particularly adds much. It's almost like it's meant to be hinting to the idea of kind of like the Ned Kelly losing his grip on what's happening and him kind of spiraling a bit. But it doesn't do that particularly well. That's the key thing. I don't think it's a particularly well-told story. There's interesting visuals. I think there's some good acting here, but it's not a very well-told story. And in that regard, I then start to look back at Justin Kurzel's other films. The reason that Macbeth worked quite well for me was the fact that it was an adaptation of Macbeth. You then look to something like Assassin's Creed, which of course is a very different type of film, but barely coherent. And I'm not really finding a lot to latch on to in the last two segments of this film, which I think is a shame, because the first one I think really had some potential there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the stuff that's introduced in the first act, they basically, that happens. So you've got the the sort of steel house, I guess, that Russell Crowe kind of hides out in, that's completely bulletproof. That's brought back in a very like obvious of a way. You've got the line from Russell Crowe where he says that every man's got to write his own story. Don't leave it up to the English to tell it. They'll only up and steal the proceeds, which is obviously quite a sort of on the nose line of, you've got English money and you've got English actors in this film, so are they sort of trying to kind of point a finger, poke fun at themselves and that. But all of these things are very then brought back in the second and third acts in very kind of obvious ways that don't have the same panache as the first act.
There's a lot of emphasis put on kind of like the lack of empathy and the brutality of kind of the colonial authorities. And obviously, as you said, that's kind of driven through a lot of, English actors with plummy accents compared to sort of like invariably people with Irish accents elsewhere. But in terms of dealing with the brutality of kind of the colonial authorities and the oppression of people at that time in Australia, another film that we reviewed on the show a while ago actually probably does this quite a bit better, and it was the Nightingale, directed by Jennifer Kent. It's quite a brutal film, and I think when we reviewed it, me and Amanda were both of the opinion that it's maybe to its detriment quite how brutal it is. But in terms of the quality of the filmmaking, the quality of the storytelling, I think it does some of the stuff that this is actually looking to do quite a bit better.